Mere hours after the outbreak of war between Britain and France on May 18, 1803, French troops were on the march. General Edouard Mortier crossed the Rhine and invaded Hanover, only barely missing the Hanoverian army which was evacuated to Britain by sea. Another French army under General Laurent St-Cyr was ordered south to Naples to recover the vital strategic ports of Brindisi and Taranto. As these invasions progressed, First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte laid the groundwork for an invasion of England proper. Right along the Channel coast, various ports were selected as rallying points for the invasion. From west to east, they included Brest, Boulogne, Ambleteuse, Montreuil-sur-Mer, Bruges, and Utrecht. Antwerp and its harbour of Flushing was selected as the main port for the Dutch fleet, and built up into a colossal naval arsenal. Reserve camps for artillery and cavalry were located inland at Saint-Omer, Compiègne, Arras, Wimereux, Paris, Amiens, and Etaples. Between these camps were split 70,000 troops. Since Naples and Hanover had been quickly overrun, this represented about a third of France's fighting strength. The units earmarked for the invasion were drawn mainly from the Army of the West and the Army of the Vendée. Generals Nicolas Jean Soult and Michel Ney were placed in overall command of the coyly named Army of the Ocean Coasts, but overall command was transferred to Napoleon when he arrived on scene in November, setting up his headquarters at Boulogne. From here he personally directed preparations. The work occurred both at an immense scale and at the level of minute detail. Napoleon worked hand in glove with Alexandre Berthier in readying the army. What they ambitiously referred to as the Army of England numbered around 120,000 by December 1802. Berthier's list from the 23rd records 79,000 infantry, 17,600 cavalrymen, and a similar number of horses, 4,700 artillerymen, and several hundred pieces of cannon. In addition were thousands of engineers, doctors and medical staff, and civilians hired on for transport and construction. Though the channel from Calais to Dover is only about 30 miles, embarking and then disembarking 120,000 men, all their equipment, horses, wagons, cannon, food, ammunition, baggage and more, would be an undertaking so difficult it seemed folly. Writing from Saint-Omer, Soult protested that even if it were possible to land, it had been impossible to do so within 24 hours as Napoleon demanded. At this the First Consul bristled. Quote, "Impossible. I am not familiar with the word. It is not in the French language, so erase it from your vocabulary." Soult was quite right to fret over the speed of the landing. Spending too long out in the mercurial English Channel would be inviting disaster, either from a sudden gale or a Royal Navy patrol. So to get the army out of port as soon as possible, the soldiers were put to work expanding and enlarging the ports. Likewise, the channels that connected all the ports were widened to ease riverine transport and communication. To actually ferry the troops across, Napoleon had ordered shipwrights to design a cheap but dependable boat for cross-channel travel. They settled on a flat-bottom design with a low draft and the ability to land directly on the beach. Unfortunately, this meant they handled like cork on the water, so other sturdier craft were requisitioned. By the time of Napoleon's arrival in November, there were already 500. By 1804, there would be around 1,000 of these landing ships, to be escorted by hundreds more gunboats and 250 sloops of war. During invasion preparations, the sister republics chipped in. The Batavian Republic joined the war on France's side, lending their military strength, namely their navy. On paper, 15 ships of the line sounded pretty good, but the real advantage conferred by the Dutch was the knowledge of their pilots and captains, who knew the channel inside out. They could also provide gunboats and transports for the invasion. The Italian Republic and Ligurian Republic on the other side of the continent had a rapidly growing army but a puny navy. Unable to offer any direct aid, they did provide funds instead. The Swiss Confederation was allowed to remain neutral, but at the cost of maintaining at their own expense the 18 Swiss battalions in French service. Spain, as a French ally, was pressured to join the war too, but for the vacillating Manuel Godoy, the Spanish Prime Minister, there was no common cause for France and Spain to share, especially since Napoleon was interfering in domestic Spanish affairs by, for example, authorizing the rehabilitation of the Jesuits long exiled by the Spanish Bourbons. Napoleon agreed not to invoke their mutual defense clause, but in exchange, Madrid would furnish 6 million livres a year and only be called into the war in extreme circumstances. Even so, Spain was still to deny their ports to British trade. Extreme circumstances were certainly reached when, in October 1803, a Spanish fleet returning from New Spain laden with gold and silver was waylaid by a British squadron. One ship was sunk and the other 3 taken as prizes, their £900,000 sterling worth of loot taken intact. If the Spanish had been skittish about war before, they were certain to join now on the back of a brazen attack made without a declaration of war. The Spanish War fleet, though underfunded and undersupplied, was readied for war. Despite the support from our allies and the thoroughness of the preparations, the real problem facing Napoleon was not economic, nor even logistical, it was naval. Any invasion attempt would inevitably contend with the two-channel squadrons, totaling some 60 warships. And even could the French land, resupply by sea would be extremely difficult. There was even semi-serious talk of floating supplies over by balloon. Napoleon expected that the invasion could be made overnight in about 8 hours, assuming the weather was good. But the Council of France's top naval minds, from Naval Minister Denis de Creye to all of the senior admirals, was consistently against the invasion. There were two problems as far as they saw it. Beyond the squadrons already in the Channel, another was soon to return from the Caribbean after recapturing pretty well all of France's colonies. In the Mediterranean, Horatio Nelson dominated, blockading the ports and keeping a portion of the French fleet bobbing uselessly in Toulon. In response to the intense logging of Hanover, with the wood being used to build invasion ships, a Royal Navy squadron blockaded the outlets of the Weser and the Elbe, thereby completely denying freedom of movement to any French shipping. This left only a dispersed and unready French fleet to face the might of the Royal Navy, the second problem. France had no shortage of fine sailors or talented officers. Their senior admirals, Eustache Bruix, Honoré Gontame, Laurent Trouget, Pierre Villeneuve, and Louis Treville, were a dream team, a match for any navy in the world, so long as it wasn't the British fleet. France had around 24 ships ready to go. Britain had 200, though to be fair, less than a third was at sea at any one time. France's ships were fast and well armed, and of a sleeker, more modern design, but the Royal Navy had both quality and quantity, in addition to a long-established shipbuilding industry and maritime tradition. Even before the outbreak of hostilities, the British government had released funds for a massive expansion of the Navy in response to warnings of ill-preparedness. The Royal Navy had 84,000 sailors, and the talented, brilliant leaders like Sidney Smith, John Jarvis, and of course Horatio Nelson. France's naval woes were compounded when, in 1804, Treville died from disease contracted whilst with the Leclerc expedition, with Bruix following not long after. Nonetheless, Napoleon was adamant that the Toulon fleet under Pierre Villeneuve could sail all the way from France to Martinique, where they would rendezvous with the Caribbean squadron. This combined fleet of 50 ships would confound the British, who Napoleon assumed would send out much of their strength to hunt them down. They would thereby be caught unprepared when the combined fleet reappeared near Boulogne. The strenuous objections of the admirals pleaded that the plan took no account of prevailing winds, tidal movements, nor even really the Royal Navy's supremacy. And indeed, rather than let the invasion go unopposed, Sidney Smith raided the French coast in October 1803, albeit to little effect. Against these protests, Napoleon railed, ranting at his admirals, castigating them publicly. His anger couldn't change the facts. The plan was overly ambitious in the extreme, betraying Napoleon's poor understanding of naval affairs. Villeneuve would only escape Toulon in March 1805, by which time the invasion was well and truly dead in the water. Needing more ships, and soon, the first consul shopped around for allies. Denmark was chomping at the bit for some retaliation for 1801's Battle of Copenhagen. Unfortunately for the French though, the Danish-Norwegian navy was currently on the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Their other 26 ships were held in reserve in case the Brits went for round 2. Where the Danes were eager but unable, the Swedes were able but uneager. The King of Sweden, Gustav Adolf IV, was half inclined to side with Britain. Nonetheless, Napoleon was undeterred in his plans, contending that Britain had been invaded before and it could happen again. He was referring here mostly to Caesar's invasion of Britannia and the relatively recent Glorious Revolution of 1688. Of course, conveniently glossed over was that Caesar had been repelled at first and only partially succeeded on his second go, and that the Dutch had been invited, greeted at Torbay not by bayonets, but by abeyant onlookers. Directions to Louis Denon that medals be struck claiming to have been minted in London, references and propaganda to France's victory in the 100 Years' War, and descriptions of Britain as the North Sea Carthage were very optimistic indeed. But if a landing could be made, the idea was, obviously, to land on Britain's southern shores. Pretty well all the major coastal towns and ports were to be attacked by at least a regiment, while the main force disembarked around Kent. Poring over maps of England, Napoleon then dictated orders for each regiment, determining what towns they were to take after landing. Within 5 days, the army would converge on London, assault the capital, and dictate a peace from Westminster. Of course, it was expected that the British would put up fierce resistance, especially in defence of the landing points. but Napoleon rightly estimated that however stalwart the redcoats were, at only around 10,000 regulars, they would be too few on their own. Of this fact His Majesty's government was well aware. Reforms to the army were passed and tens of thousands of fencibles, the militia, were called up. Supplies and readiness were woeful, but close to their bases and a friendly population, should it come down to it, the Brits would put up one hell of a fight. To forewarn of any invasion were 73 watchtowers dotted along the southern coast, and depots were placed in the rear lines around fortified towns. If worst came to worst and London itself was in peril, earthworks were built to protect its southern flank. These developments put paid to Napoleon's fanciful belief that the opposition Whigs would gladly side with the invading French. Rather than creating, quote, disunion sufficient to paralyse the rest of the nation, the Whigs and Tories were both united on the need to fight. By January 1804, preparations were about as complete as they could be, and the invasion could commence. If the weather allowed, it was only the Royal Navy that need be worried about. In order to make sure they were out of position, Napoleon gambled on a pretty desperate diplomatic play. He had details of the plan purposefully leaked to the British Embassy in Vienna, the idea being to convince London it was all a ruse. However, this proof that the invasion was merely a show failed to convince the Admiralty. So turning to more intrigue, Napoleon set his sights on the Irish. Since August of 1803, he'd been in contact with the United Irishmen, and they assured him that though under the English boot, they'd rise to aid a French army. However, Napoleon was still set on his invasion of England, and the Irish leaders refused to join in directly. Changing tack, he offered in September 1804 16,000 men for an expedition to the Irish coast, but this never came to fruition. Listing from disappointment to disappointment, whilst juggling all of the logistical complexities of an invasion, and, mind you, still running a nation by letter, it's no wonder Napoleon sought distraction whilst in Boulogne. He took up with a mistress, referring to her in saucy letters only as Madame F. There were also trysts with actresses, and the mistresses of his generals and ministers. Letters back to Josephine kept up the pretense of fidelity, but by now Napoleon's appetites were little more than open secrets. Ironically enough, the French weren't the first to land in Britain. Rather, the British were the first to land in France. The secretive war of intrigue between both sides was in full swing. Dissenters, émigrés and Chouans, who had sought refuge in Britain, were sent back to France to stir up trouble, potentially even assassinate Napoleon if they could. The leader of these expeditions was infiltrator extraordinaire John Wesley Wright, about the closest real history ever got to the Scarlet Pimpernel. In the murky world of intelligence, Wright's connections to the government were indirect. He worked on the orders of Lord Keith of the Admiralty, who in turn took orders from Addington, Castlereagh and others. Unfortunately for the Brits though, they were contending with the most formidable spy master of his age, Joseph Fouché. His informants, spies and double agents were everywhere, and quickly revealed the breadth of British espionage. In August 1803, a Chouan named Georges Cadoudal was landed in Normandy, and a few months later in January, a bunch of royalists were disgorged. One among them was Charles Pichegru, a known quantity from our look at the French Revolution. A disaffected Jacobin turned royalist, he had been ousted way back in 1797 during the coup of Fructidor. Defecting to Britain, he'd now returned to France to abduct Napoleon, which may be taken to mean assassinate. Pichegru's involvement raised eyebrows. Fouché and Napoleon deliberated on what to do, but it was decided to let the plot unfold. A week after landing, Pichegru met with the demure General Victor Moreau, whose distaste for Napoleon and impeccable credentials was sure to mean he joined the plot. It was not so. Though he would not shed a tear should Napoleon take a knife to the back, Moreau took his oath seriously. On January 29th, the day after this meeting, Fouché pounced, arresting a British agent who grassed his mates. Pichegru was confirmed as being in France and in league with Cadoudal. Both were hunted without rest. Paris was on high alert and gendarmes prowled the streets. An independent police unit led by Jean-Marie Savary honed in on Cadoudal but only found his associates. Pichegru was found at a hotel in Paris on February 26th and only arrested after a sharp scuffle with 3 gendarmes. So too was Moreau arrested, along with his aides-de-camp Libert and Souham. The pretext of potential involvement in a conspiracy was more than enough for Napoleon to eliminate his only real rival. Of this, Napoleon said to General Jean Reynier, "Well, guess what I've just done? I've ordered the arrest of Moreau. It'll make a fine scandal, won't it? People will not omit to say that I'm jealous of Moreau, that it's revenge that drives me, and 1,000 silly things of the same kind. Me, really? Jealous of Moreau?" Cadoudal evaded capture until March 9th, killing 1 police officer and leading the others on a carriage chase. When caught, he repeated only that his mission was to kill Napoleon. So forced to rely on the faulty testimony of Cadudal's co-conspirators, Fouché made a terrible mistake. It was revealed that, not long after landing, Pichegru and Cadudal had met with an officer from the émigré army of Condé, and both Fouché and Talleyrand were certain it could be only one culprit, Louis-Antoine de Bourbon, the Duc d'Enghien. Enghien was the grandson of the Prince of Condé, and served without aplomb for a few years. The only evidence linking him to the plots on Napoleon was circumstantial, a description from an eyewitness and proximity. Enghien lived in Ettenheim in Baden, so literally just across the French border. Napoleon thought the evidence flimsy, noting that Cadudal hadn't mentioned anyone by name, but Fouché chalked this up to Cadudal's resistance to interrogation, and not evidence against a conspiracy. Rather, he played to Napoleon's suspicions that old General Charles-François Dumouriez was in on the plot to convince the First Consul that the Duke's involvement was genuine. At a council meeting on March 10th, Talleyrand chimed in to support Fouché and, going one step further, suggested that Enghien be captured along with Dumouriez. The operation would be quick and quiet, carried out by loyal men. This time, a General Armand Caulaincourt went undercover in Offenburg to organise things, while commander of the Grenadiers à Cheval, General Michel Ordonnier, would carry out the mission. Leading a dragoon troop across the border on the night of March 15th, Ordonnier caught Enghien quite literally undressed. The Duke was bundled up and hustled back to France, along with a few million francs and all of his letters. To soothe things over with Baden, Caulaincourt offered assurances that the mission had been of the utmost necessity, and no affront was intended. Dumouriez was nowhere to be found, and indeed, he had never once been involved in the conspiracy. Neither had the Duke ever met with Cadudal or any of Wright's men. Enghien's papers proved only that which might be reasonably deduced, that he plotted a Bourbon restoration and took money from the British. These were certainly crimes, capital crimes even, but public opinion and the opinion of the courts of Europe flew in the face of an execution. Napoleon, however, was adamant that an example be made of Enghien. He had already dealt with threats from the ex-Jacobins. It was now time to eliminate those from the Legitimists. All of his council was in agreement, so on March 18th, Joachim Murat, then serving as the governor of Paris, was ordered to convene a military tribunal to try Enghien. Murat was very flaky on the whole thing, and at first protested directly to Napoleon, trying to have Enghien diverted elsewhere. Napoleon shot back with a barbed reply. I have received your letter. Know this. If the Duc de Berry were in Paris and living in the house of Gebenzel, and if the Duc d'Orléans were staying with Gallo, not only would I have them arrested this very night and shot, but I would also have these ambassadors arrested and made to suffer the same fate. International law would not be seriously violated. There is no prince in Paris other than Enghien. Get that well into your head, and don't listen to anything that tells you otherwise. Tail between his legs, Murat convened a 7-man court-martial. Conducted at the imposing Château de Vincennes on the eastern outskirts of Paris, the tribunal was as swift as it was foregone. 11 questions personally written up by Napoleon were asked of Enghien. Have you taken up arms against France? Have you accepted pay from England? He answered them all honestly, expecting, as supposedly did the tribunal, that he would be imprisoned, not executed. Until the end, the Duke denied any involvement with Pichegru, Dumouriez, or Cadudal, and was almost certainly telling the truth. Still, collusion with foreign powers and active plotting were capital offences. Enghien had missed his chance to come in from the cold with the émigrés, instead conspiring against France. Led down to the muddy moat surrounding Vincennes, he was shot dead and buried warm. The Duke of Enghien affair, as it later came to be known, was a critical miscalculation on Napoleon's part. He thought he was well and truly justified, as evinced by his claim to Murat that, quote, law would not be seriously violated. But the courts of Europe begged to differ. In their minds, it was not only a gross injustice, but an international crime. Enghien had been living peacefully in Baden, and was not Napoleon's to kidnap, let alone execute. Moreover, the lack of substantive evidence only compounded the problem, leading many to assume that Enghien had been killed merely on a whim. Napoleon's allure as a benign, enlightened despot was worn perilously thin. Many friends and allies in France abhorred the act, hyperbolically comparing it to Robespierre's reign of terror. Ambassadors to France issued universal denunciations, and even the Council of State wasn't mute on their criticism. The very men who had engineered Enghien's kidnapping were now at each other's throats to shirk responsibility. It's here that we have those rightly famous words tied to the Duke of Enghien affair. Quote, "It was worse than a crime, it was a mistake." This quote, likely from Fouché, is sometimes misattributed to Talleyrand. As for Napoleon himself, he endured the hushed tones and furtive glances at a reception at Malmaison the night the news spread. On the 23rd, the next day, he acknowledged the backlash at a council meeting and tried to formulate an official line. He remained confident in his decision. "I have shown what I am capable of. The Duke of Enghien was a conspirator like any other, and it was necessary to treat him as a criminal. The Bourbons will always see such things through the Œil de Bœuf, and are fated to live under an eternal delusion. I have shed blood, I shall perhaps shed more, but never in anger, and even then, merely because bloodletting factors into the practice of political medicine." Such excuses made in confidence didn't see much publicity, thus the fact of the affair hung like a cloud over Paris without official input. In this information vacuum, the journals and pundits opined, and agents from foreign powers stoked resentment. Napoleon's newfound reputation as a tyrant was lent credence when, on April 6th, Charles Pichegru was found dead in his cell. The general's suicide was unfortunate, as he was to be tried, but that did not stop public opinion supposing that this was Napoleon clearing house. Faced with such backlash, he opined, quote, "I will respect the judgment of public opinion when it is well founded, but when capricious it must be met with contempt." It was hard to deny, however, that this was certainly a bad look. Wesley Wright was soon dead too. Captured in May 1804, he was found dead in prison in 1805, supposedly by his own hand. Though Napoleon merely banished Moreau and pardoned several of the Chouans, Enghien, Wright and Pichegru were dead. The question was asked, what lines would Napoleon not cross? With France unable to invade Britain, with Britain unable to challenge France on land, a stalemate set in, a stalemate both sides would attempt to break by enlisting allies to their cause. As we've already seen, Napoleon had made significant headway in aligning a number of states to France. There were of course these sister republics, but there was also Spain, and most recently the German powers of Bavaria, Württemberg and Baden. Britain, meanwhile, could count on the support of Portugal and Naples, for what it was worth. Naples had been forced into an alliance by France, and Portugal was menaced with invasion from Spain. Still, these small fry meant little when compared to the big fish. The real catch for British and French diplomats was Russia, Prussia, or Austria. The story of how these continental powers were allied, or alienated, set the stage for the War of the Third Coalition, so it's worth getting down to the marrow. We'll start with Prussia. For both France and Britain, Prussia was an ideal ally for one very good reason. Conventional military wisdom had their army as the finest in Europe. In any ground war, therefore, their troops would tip the scales. Here was the army of Friedrich Wilhelm II de Grosse, and certainly the son of his nephew, King Friedrich Wilhelm III, had inherited a very strong army. But the experience of war with France, fighting alongside Austria, had left a bad taste in the king's mouth. Cooperation with the Austrians had been dismal, and the Prussians took an early separate peace. Since then, it appeared from London's viewpoint that Prussia adopted a pro-French bias. They had colluded during mediatization, and Prussia had joined the now defunct League of Armed Neutrality. Truth be, Friedrich was embarking on a very fruitful policy of pragmatic neutrality. In 1803, there was nothing compelling about Britain's arguments that Prussia ought to join the League against France. Moreover, France was a natural counterweight to Austria, with whom Friedrich had no shortage of unresolved problems, namely in Bavaria and Passau. Only in the army was there any appetite for a fight, but fighting the French or the Austrians, the Russians, or hell, even the British, was all the same to them. Prussia's neutrality was only questioned in 1804. The French invasion of Hanover put Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte and a large army on Berlin's doorstep, and of course the Duke of Enghien affair inflamed anti-French sentiment. Still, it was not enough for Friedrich to ditch his neutrality, at least not yet. To the east of Prussia, stretching from Krakow to Vladivostok, was the Russian Empire. Though geographically removed from Central and Western Europe, Russia loomed large in their diplomatic calculations. Franco-Russian relations had been quite on again off again, as we've seen, with the big change coming in 1803 with the ascension of Tsar Alexander I. Unlike his late father, Alexander was inclined towards a more hostile policy towards France, and had eagerly joined Austria's coalition. However, the bungling of joint operations with the Austrians and British led to bad blood on all sides. What's more, Russia, Austria and Prussia were all naturally encroaching on each other's spheres of influence. All had a share of Poland, all viewed Germany as an area of vital concern, and all had designs on the Baltic or Mediterranean seas. Britain too was a natural enemy, with Russian and British interests in Central Asia, the Eastern Med and Scandinavia at odds. Seeing this opening, Napoleon had tried to court Alexander. Here, though, the first consul was his own worst enemy. Between the Sebastiani expedition, meddling in Italy, Switzerland, and Germany, and general expansionism, Napoleon could count on few friends in St. Petersburg. Fortunately for him, though, the British were equally friendless, as they were embroiled in a brewing conflict up north. Sweden and Russia, long-term rivals, were again on the cusp of war, this time over some islands off the Baltic coast. Reliant upon Sweden for desperately needed naval supplies, like timber and hemp, Britain was very friendly with the Swedes and eventually concluded an alliance in December 1804. Further south, the Ottoman Empire and Russia were also drawing swords, and Britain was supportive of the Ottomans. Though weak, the Ottoman Empire was steadily advancing under the reformist Sultan Selim III, and presented a counterweight to Russia in numerous areas of vital British interest. For all of Prussia's raw military power and Russia's immense potential, it was on Austria that the Third Coalition's prospects hinged. As the original instigator of the coalitions against France, and humiliated on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, Austria had obvious reason to despise the French, Napoleon in particular. But defeat and humiliation had shown Emperor Franz II that war with France was a dicey proposition. A change in course was necessary. This course was charted by Ludwig von Kebenzl, replacing Turgot as foreign minister. Kebenzl, you may recall, had many close dealings with the French and with Napoleon, and knew well their strength. On matters of foreign policy, he began to distance Austria from Britain. This was a popular move, as mutual acrimony after the disastrous joint war effort against France still burned hot. But at the same time, Kebenzl still kept France at arm's length, rejecting Napoleon's attempts to conciliate too much. Here, Franz II was inclined to bury the hatchet with France, taking advice both from Franz von Colloredo and the Archduke Charles, who both championed a pacifistic line. However, Kebenzl's assertions that Austria and France were on a collision course were proven apt as Napoleon made his plays in the Holy Roman Empire during 1803's mediatization. The Archduke Charles, at this stage, was deep in administrative and military reforms to prepare the Austrian army for a future conflict. But they were years away from completion, so in the meantime, an alliance was concluded with Russia to provide for Austrian security against France. In the midst of the whirlwind diplomacy to secure alliances in Europe, Napoleon never neglected domestic issues. Having run the nation out of Boulogne for several months, he returned to Paris in March of 1804 to oversee the Duke of Enghien affair. And it was on the back of this debacle that Napoleon summited the mountain of his own ambition. For several years now, the issue of succession had been of serious concern. Initially, as first consul, Napoleon had been keen on establishing the principle of civilian rule. When asked by one of his aides-de-camp why they don't appoint a general to the consulship, Napoleon said, quote, "You don't want a general. If I were to write my will, I would warn the nation against a military government." However, this commendable civic-mindedness had steadily eroded since 1801, coinciding with Napoleon's centralization of power. By 1804, he struck a different tune. He had the ability to name his successor, a right afforded by the Senate, which was claimed to, quote, "secure the Republic from the upheaval of elections." That it was a precursor for hereditary rule was not hard to divine, and the first consul's inclination was to name a member of the Bonaparte family. Here, Josephine was expected to play a traditional role, but was too old to bear children. It was a source of extreme disquiet for her. Napoleon later recalled, "Josephine was always thinking of the future and was alarmed at her barrenness. She realized fully that no marriage is complete and real without children. As prosperity came, her anxiety increased. She had recourse to the medical art. She frequently pretended success had resulted." By the standards of the day, Josephine was not fulfilling her duty as a wife, though it did not mean Napoleon loved her any less. Some called for a divorce, to which he defiantly retorted, "It is from a sense of justice that I will not divorce her. It may be in my interest, or the interest of my system, but I say to myself, how can I put away this excellent wife just because I am becoming great? No, that is beyond me. I have the heart of a man, not a tiger. When she dies, I'll marry again. Perhaps I will have children, but I will not make her unhappy." There were problems in their marriage as ever. Josephine spent money with abandon and swam in debt. She lied constantly, usually about little things, but she was constant, loving, and comforting. Napoleon worked extreme hours, was always tired, and his affairs were constant. However, he recalled that Josephine was always happy to see him, and insisted on travelling with him wherever he went. He later confided, "After all was said and done, Josephine made her husband happy, and was always his tenderest friend, always and in all events loyal, devoted, and self-sacrificing. I have always regarded her with tender affection and keen gratitude. Though his notions of marriage are very sexist, Napoleon did genuinely love Josephine. But love could carry them only so far without an heir. Unable to produce a direct heir, eligibility passed to the Bonaparte brothers, or their children. For all of Joseph's diplomatic experience, Napoleon only reluctantly agreed to make him the prime heir. Louis, now married to Hortense Beauharnais, was next in line. Lucien was excluded because he was unable to produce a legitimate heir, as his wife, the kindly Christine Boyer, died in childbirth in 1800. Indeed, Napoleon was particularly cruel when referring to this marriage, accusing Lucien of, quote, an unexampled egotism which has drawn him away from a splendid career, away from the path of duty and honour. Jérôme, at barely 20, was too young, and by far the most politically principled of the bunch. On Napoleon's order, Jérôme had begun a career in the Navy. To his commanding officer, Napoleon wrote, you know he requires a firm hand, so insist on his carrying out every one of the duties of his profession. Clearly, the tough treatment didn't take. On leave in America, Jérôme married a wealthy heiress named Elizabeth Patterson, rather than playing to his older brother's machinations. For all of Napoleon's love for young Eugene, he was not a Bonaparte and never considered for the succession, though he was destined for rulership. Why Napoleon was determined to secure his succession is not a hard question to answer. Imbued with immensely state power as first consul, his ambition required him to secure his own legacy and the status of his family. This hereditary drive had long been in tension with the fact that France, though autocratic and undemocratic, remained a republic. Hereditary rule was anathema to its core political principles. But so entrenched and popular was Napoleon, so inextricably linked was he with the revolution and with France, that when it became clear that he intended to establish a dynasty, few could oppose it. All the great republicans, from Kléber to Moreau, were dead or detained, and internal opposition was very limited. At first, these suggestions were put forward by the press. The propaganda machine subtly wove the idea of a hereditary succession into their narrative, and hinted that perhaps a monarchy wasn't out of order. There was some popular appeal to these ideas, which were amplified further by the press, by pundits, and eventually politicians. Supposedly spontaneous campaigns and petitions flooded into the Tuileries, affirming a monarchy, and demanding Napoleon secure the succession. Naturally, this public outcry was carefully stage-managed from on high. Napoleon pretended, however unbelievably, that he was shocked by the offer. But the fact remained that he did enjoy widespread support. The question now, put forward by the Council of State, was what reforms had to be made to the executive in order to make it hereditary. And for most councillors, the choice was obvious: a monarchy. At first, the titles of prince or king were considered, but rejected for their associations to the Bourbons. If it was to be a monarchy, a clean slate would be needed. Initially, the title of emperor was discarded, as it seemed too lofty, but perhaps that is why it recommended itself to Napoleon. Not only was the title of emperor to represent the summit of Napoleon's ambition, but it would also elevate him to the same regal level as the emperors of Russia and Austria. In reference to his quote on the root of European discord, this was clearly Napoleon's government harmonizing more closely to those of his competitors. On May 18, 1804, Napoleon wrote to the second consul, Jean-Jacques Cambacérès, to accept the crown. Citoyen Consul, your title is soon to change. Your functions and my confidence in you remain unchanged. You will continue to display as Arch-Chancellor of the Empire, as you did in the office of Second Consul, the wisdom in council and the distinguished talent that have made your share so large in all that I may have accomplished. Everything that can increase the happiness of the nation is linked to my own. I accept a title that you believe will be of service. I hope that France will never regret the honours she has bestowed on my family. Not only was Napoleon taking the crown, he promised to richly reward his allies. Lands and titles were to be handed out, and titles like Your Highness, Excellency, and Monsieur were to re-enter formal use. This change from republic to empire looks, from afar, like a sudden shift, but we know it's not. Since the revolution ended, French democracy had been whittled away until Napoleon inherited only the pillars of a republican government in 1799. From there, in establishing a Napoleonic state, national institutions, be they civil, military, administrative, religious, or economic, were suborned to a central authority. Order, above all, was Napoleon's guiding principle, and that meant a strict hierarchy. Thus, the formation of the empire represents not much more than the culmination of a years-long process, and the definitive formation of the Napoleonic state, reforged as a French empire. its institutions would, aside from the executive, remain unchanged. The legislature, departmental administration, or the financial and legal systems would remain fixed. However, the imagery and symbology of France was rapidly transformed. It was not to be a hard break with the past, and indeed much of the Republican imagery remained intact, with, for instance, the tricolour remaining the national flag, and Le Chant du Départ, a revolutionary song, remaining a national anthem. But in the main, Napoleon reversed course from republicanism to go all in on empire. Revived were many of the features of the old Bourbon monarchy. A peerage system was established to reward loyal Bonapartists. Marshals' batons were divvied out to 18 senior generals. Most controversially, the aristocracy was revived, with land and titles once again to carry political and social benefits. Though Napoleon faced a negligible institutional resistance to his imperial coronation, there did remain the question of how the French people would react. That France had abandoned its democratic principles for autocracy was generally accepted by the people as the price of peace, prosperity, and stability. Gains for the revolution could be institutionalized and the rigors of war left in the past. But now, with war again engulfing the continent, and Napoleon forsaking even the barest pretense of republicanism, dissent was assured. Though popular, Napoleon's rule was essentially personalist, predicated on the creation of an elite that supported him. In politically and economically supporting middle and upper class interests, the gradual restratification of French society post-revolution had come full circle with the advent of empire. Society was again divided between the elite and the commons, with Napoleon's main base of support coming from the elite he had either created, so the administrative cadre and the Bonapartist political class, and the elite he had co-opted. Here we have the émigrés, the clergy, the military, and the middle class. The security of his rule did not technically require a popular mandate to function, but Napoleon was no tyrant, and knew it immensely helpful to have people on side, especially with a war on. Thus, decisions that eroded egalitarianism, like the reintroduction of the aristocracy and social privilege, both of which contributed to a precipitous climb in wealth inequality, threatened to disillusion French citizens at a critical moment. Indeed, conditions for the poor generally grew worse from 1803 onwards, as the elite consolidated the absolute majority of the nation's wealth. It was in these conditions that France's first mutual aid society was founded at Grenoble. Unwilling to compromise on his vision, Napoleon didn't offer any political concessions to the common citizenry, as he had for the elite. Instead, he appealed to their well-developed sense of patriotism. Steeped in years of revolution, the French people were and would remain citizens, each individual conscious of their role to play. But calling on them to defend la patrie against a foreign invader was one thing, it was another thing entirely to demand they fight and die in an offensive war. Napoleon's weren't defensive wars, so patriotism therefore had to be converted into nationalism. And it's here that the Napoleonic propaganda machine kicked into overdrive. Rather than harp on about national defense, it was national honor that had been besmirched. The emperor called upon the citizens and soldiers to avenge these insults. There was a populist energy to much of this rhetoric, and indeed, when Napoleon claimed, however ironically, that he was fighting against counter-revolution, it was not hard for the people to be convinced. For most, France was the revolution, and since Napoleon was France, support for one ensured support for the other. That's not to say Napoleon only demanded but did not reciprocate. Exemplary service could ensure admission into the ranks of the elite, almost like a treat dangled before someone's eyes. Loyalty and service to France was richly rewarded, regardless of status, just as in the days of the Revolution. Of course, there were many ways to serve the nation, and Napoleon's reward schemes held in equally high regard the bureaucrats who staffed the ministries, the mothers who willingly sent their sons off to war, and the doctors suturing wounds and stinting broken bones. But pride of place was, and always would be, given to the military. In France, the revolutionary years had completely transformed public perception of the military. Where before a soldier was liable to be banned from public parks, he now enjoyed authentic esteem from his fellow citizens, and within the brigades of the army, there was camaraderie born of hardship. To inculcate and foster this esprit de corps, Napoleon elevated common soldiers or entire units to the ranks of the elite, just like he did with civilians. The best example was his own consular guard, now redubbed the Imperial Guard. Likewise, in 1802, the Légion d'honneur was founded. An elaborate system of medals, awards, ribbons, prize money, and attendant pensions, even exclusive schools for the children of recipients, with all these benefits varying for each of the 15 cohorts, were handed out for civilians and soldiers deemed worthy of esteem. Reflecting the peculiar Napoleonic fusion of old and new, the simple but striking white star revoked the old Order of Saint-Louis from the Ancien Regime. while the inscription, Honneur et Patrie, Napoleon's personal touch, spoke to a revolutionary rationale. The inaugural awards were endowed at a grand ceremony at Les Invalides in July 1804. As Napoleon pinned the cross to the chests of recipients, soldiers marched by in formation. Napoleon understood very well the lengths men would go to be acknowledged for their service, giving rise to his famous remark, quote, "Men will do anything for a strip of coloured ribbon." Rewards weren't merely symbolic, however. A full 200,000 francs was to be given out to recipients each year. Among the first recipients were many of the savants from the Institut, Monge, Laplace, and Berthollet, along with administrators and ministers who aided in the drafting of the Napoleonic Code, so Cambacérès, Lebrun, Chaptal, Berthollet, Tronchet, and Bigot. Aiding in the smooth transition from Republic to Empire was the relatively quick time frame for the change, making it something of a fait accompli. The Empire was decided upon in June of 1804 and officially declared on August 7th. That month, a plebiscite was returned in favour of Empire, with 3.5 million positive votes. In a recurring theme for Napoleonic plebiscites, the vote was horrifically rigged. Napoleon and his ministers were known to simply fudge the numbers, and Portalis was ordered to invent numbers for the army. Still, there was little outcry against the Empire. For most, the change merely confirmed that which already was, that Napoleon was supreme. Preparations for the coronation accelerated after August. The scale and extravagance of the thing was off the chart. The finest fabrics from a revitalized Lyon would be used for everything from drapes to dresses. 6-foot-tall grenadiers were to march in rigid columns, their bayonets gleaming. 50,000 francs were earmarked for the coronation, but the budget ended up blowing out to 4 times as much. It was a grandiose, spectacular display of immense prestige, meant to stupefy onlookers with France's wealth and the boundless glory of its empire. Even the Pope was invited. It was important to Napoleon that he come, mostly to signify that rapprochement between Paris and Rome was real. "The re-establishment of religion," Napoleon wrote, "led me to beg your holiness to give me proof of your new interest in this great nation and one of the most important events in human history." Niceties obscured Napoleon's more pragmatic objective. He would pay deference to the Church's spiritual authority, but by making the Pope come to him, prove the temporal power belonged to France, and France alone. Pope Pius VII had no stomach for Napoleon's imperial farce, and tried to worm his way out by citing the Duke of Anjou affair. In the end though, Napoleon's gravity was irresistible. He and Pius entered Paris together on November 25th. All deference was to be shown. Napoleon declared that the Pope ought to be treated as though, quote, he had 200,000 soldiers at his back. An already masterful diplomatic stroke became a diplomatic coup when, on December 1st, Napoleon and Josephine married for the second time, this time under Catholic rites. Politicians, ministers, officers, foreign dignitaries, and other distinguished guests convened in the early morning at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on Sunday, December 2nd. Damaged during the Revolution, Notre Dame had been chosen by Napoleon because he thought, quote, it appeals more strongly to imagination and will add dignity to the ceremony. At great expense, restoration had made large strides, but even then preparations were a bit iffy. As the guests entered, workmen made last-minute fixes to a large damaged archway. As guests took their seat in the packed hall, 460 musicians from 3 different orchestras began to tune their instruments. The boom of artillery from the west heralded Napoleon's departure from the Tuileries. The procession was truly grand. Napoleon and Josephine peered out from the glass of a bespoke carriage, led by 8 pristine white horses and driven by coachman César. On the flanks were soldiers of the Imperial Guard, the Garde Cuirassiers, and the Mameluke. Marat, having organised the procession, led from the front, weaving the way through the streets packed with onlookers. Thousands of soldiers stood watch, but there was little hint of disorder. With snow falling, the imperial procession heaved into place before the courtyard of Notre Dame at around 11 a.m. For the next 45 minutes, Napoleon and Josephine were attended by their staffs and fitted with imperial regalia. Wearing an elegant satin dress, Josephine's style ached with classical connotations. She was Calpurnia and Napoleon Caesar. To complete the look, she was cuffed in golden jewellery, diamonds shimmering from earrings and bracelets. As for Napoleon, he wore his own extravagant attire only reluctantly. When his chamberlain, Théodore Thiers, had called on his master that morning, he found Napoleon already fully dressed, but still wearing a chasseur's uniform over the imperial regalia, a frankly ridiculous sight. By now, Napoleon had removed his military coat to reveal the robes underneath. Like Josephine, his velvet attire was a sheer white, accentuating the gold of the ruff and embroidery. In elaborate patterns were woven long golden bands bearing a prominent bee motif, the honeybee having been chosen by Napoleon as his family's new emblem, as it evoked the ancient Merovingian dynasty, the dynasty of Clovis I, the first king of the Franks. On Napoleon's head was a Roman laurel wreath, reflecting both an acknowledgement to republic and empire. To complete the extravagant look, Napoleon and Josephine were each donned in a sprawling red velvet cape lined in ermine fur. Here too the motif continued, with the golden bees wreathed in laurels of olive leaves. As Joseph, Louis and others heaved the 30-kilo cape into place, Napoleon turned to his brothers and whispered in Italian, "If only our father could see us now." The Archbishop of Paris greeted the imperial couple at the entrance and welcomed them into Notre Dame with a sprinkling of holy water. Passing through the central aisle covered in green carpet and by banners bearing the crossed keys of St. Peter, Napoleon and Josephine shuffled through slowly, hundreds of eyes appraising their every movement. Josephine's sisters, her mother and friend, Laure Junot, wife of General Junot, aided movement by holding the cape above the ground. Arm in arm, Josephine and Napoleon approached the altar. They halted at the steps, where above them stood Rome's contribution, several cardinals, the archbishop, and seated on a throne, Pope Pius himself. The coronation ceremony began with a traditional hymn, followed by another and another. It was expected that Napoleon sing along, and so he did, having memorized the verses. But the length of the ceremony clearly bored him. Madame Junot noted more than a few stifled yawns. Pius then delivered the litany, and afterwards an unction to both Napoleon and Josephine, anointing them with myrrh. Oil smeared on their hands and face, though not to their liking, was borne with a bowed head. At this point, it would have been traditional for Napoleon, in the style of the Bourbons, to take communion and give a confession. But Napoleon defied tradition by taking neither. He also defied tradition by having Josephine's rites delivered immediately after his own, where typically women rulers were ignored until the male ruler is crowned. The pattern of breaking tradition was followed when it came time for the coronation. Ordinarily, a monarch would be crowned by a Catholic priest, symbolizing power coming from God down to the church and thereby to the monarch. A precedent established with Charlemagne's imperial coronation as Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. And since Napoleon's coronation closely resembled that of Charlemagne's, and the Pope was there, it was expected by pretty well everyone that he would follow tradition. It was not to be. From a cushion, Napoleon himself took the crown of Charlemagne and mimed placing it on his own head. Placing the crown back on the cushion, he then took another crown and placed that on Josephine's head as she knelt. Napoleon took great care placing the crown on his wife's head, gently fitting it until it rested perfectly in place. All the while, tears fell from behind Josephine's closed eyes. Exactly why is guesswork. Rising together, Napoleon and Josephine were given a final blessing from Pius. He then embraced Napoleon and uttered the closing refrain in perfect church Latin, Vivat Imperator in Aeternum. At this, the choir chimed in with a Te Deum. Now was time for Napoleon's imperial oath. I swear to maintain the integrity of the territory of the Republic, to respect and cause to be respected the laws of the Concordat and of freedom of worship, of political and civil liberty, of the irreversibility of the sale of the national lands, to raise no taxes except by virtue of the law, to govern only in view of the interest, the well-being, and the glory of the French people. With these words, the French Republic died, and the French Empire was created. Emperor Napoleon I and Empress Josephine were showered in acclaim and applause. It was the ultimate triumph for Napoleon as a figure of singular ambition and talent. Here he was elevated to the ranks of Alexander, of Charlemagne, and of Clovis, to live as emperor forever, as the Pope had proclaimed. But unlike other monarchs, Napoleon was undeniably cut from a different cloth. In denying the Pope his right to crown monarchs, Napoleon had established two principles. Firstly, that he was his own man, and though he strove for eternal glory, his power was rooted in his own temporal capacities, not divine right. Though Napoleon claimed to believe in a kind of fate, in destiny, he certainly possessed an immense degree of self-worth and confidence. Here was a man who genuinely believed himself to be one of history's great men, and now had the crown to prove it. I was born in poverty, I have risen by my deeds. To reign in France one must be born for greatness, must be seen from childhood in a palace, surrounded by guards, or as in my case, be a man capable of raising himself above all others. My mistress is power. I have conquered too much to let her be snatched away from me. Although it may be said that power comes from me of her own accord, I well know what labour, what sleepless nights, what scheming she has required. The second principle that Napoleon had established was that this was a French empire, embarking upon a separate destiny. Though his coronation took the form of a mass, and though it was styled on those of the Bourbons, the overt breaks with tradition marked the empire out as unique. For example, Josephine crowned as empress alongside the emperor, and this particular moment immortalized in Jacques-Louis David's painting, fleur-de-lis replaced by golden bees, a monarchy proclaimed, but a republic acknowledged in the coronation oath, and a crown placed atop the emperor's head by his own hand, power to speak on behalf of France bestowed upon himself. From later exile he declared, "Before me I saw the crown of France lying in a gutter. I picked it up with my sword, but the French people placed it atop my head." Where Caesar had rejected the crown, Napoleon had taken it, knowing well that sovereignty in France still stemmed from a popular mandate. Indeed, as he already had done, Napoleon remained committed to rule by his brand of enlightened despotism, or benevolent dictatorship. Power was centralized, but not absolute. To re-solidify this commitment, he met with the legislature and representatives from across the administration. "I have sought to lend a more imposing dignity to your labours. Emperor, magistrate, soldier, citizen, each in their own sphere, will have but one aim, the interest of the nation. If this throne, to which destiny and the French people have called me, is precious in my eyes, it is for the sole reason that by it alone the most precious rights of France be preserved. Without a strong and paternal government, France would have to fear for a return to the evils she once suffered. Weakness in the executive power is the calamity of nations. As a general, then as first consul, I had but one purpose. As emperor, it remains the same, the prosperity of France. If death does not surprise me in the midst of my labours, I hope to leave to posterity a renown that may always serve as an example, or as a reproach to my successors." It was a surprisingly frank address, showing that Napoleon was aware of his place in history, for better or worse, and that he still considered his solemn duty to France paramount, that he was effectively a civil servant, albeit one clad in purple. There was no mistaking Napoleon for anything less than an emperor, and yet he remained, to his core, citizen Bonaparte. In the days after the coronation, Napoleon organised for more festivities. The aristocrats, the clergy and the courts of Europe had had their display. It was now time for the army and the people to have theirs. For the rest of the day of the coronation and the days following, Paris was one great big party. The city skyline erupted with brilliant fireworks, every street was festooned in imperial livery, and wine flowed in torrents. So too were prizes and straight-up cash payouts offered to the citizenry, adding to the jolly atmosphere. Riding this wave of enthusiasm, Emperor Napoleon attended an elaborate ceremony at the Champ de Mars on December 5th. Seated atop a throne that backed up onto the École Militaire, Napoleon appraised his army as it marched by. The weather was awful, rain fell in buckets, but the army cut a marvellous sight. Here the Napoleonic eagle made its first appearance. Though funnily enough the lion was chosen as the official faunal symbol of France, the eagle was always preferred for its allusions to ancient Rome. The martial ethos of the Roman Republic and later Empire were potent symbols, and revived in full for France. For each regiment in the army, an eagle standard was crafted, a golden eagle perched atop a bronze base, and held aloft on a tall oaken staff, above the regimental colours. The colours too were amended, the revolutionary tricolour maintained, but adorned now with the acclamation, "Vive l'Empereur des Français." Colonels from every regiment, playing the role of vexillarius, received the colours directly from Napoleon. Unperturbed by the rain, the emperor declared to his army, "Soldiers, here are your standards. The eagles will forever be your rallying points. Do you swear to lay down your lives in their defence, and by your courage to maintain them always on the path to victory?" "We swear," came the reply. There could be no doubt as to the loyalty of the army, nor its élan. As mentioned, part of the rationale behind Napoleon's coronation as emperor was to be more palatable to the monarchies of Europe. For many supporters of Napoleon in these states, the imperial coronation came as an immense shock. He was seen as a lawgiver and a peacemaker, wedded to republican ideals, and yet here he was donned in royal purple. It seemed a betrayal. Ludwig van Beethoven's magnificent Eroica Symphony was initially dedicated to the first consul, but Napoleon's name was scribbled out by the disillusioned composer. Napoleon could afford to lose support from enlightened Europeans, so long as his diplomatic gambit paid off. It did not. Even with a scepter in hand and a crown on his head, Napoleon still presented an imposing figure to the crowned heads of Europe. He did have plenty of admirers in the courts of Europe, as well as plenty of detractors, but all the detractors had to do was point to a laundry list of grievances to curry anti-French sentiment. For Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the Duke of Enghien affair was the final straw. Napoleon, for his part, pointed out the hypocrisy. Had not Russia assassinated their Tsar when he took a fancy for France? Still, Napoleon's flagrant violation of law, when combined with the spectre of French expansionism, herded the European monarchies into Britain's coalition. William Pitt, replacing the anemic administration of Lord Addington, redoubled British coalition-building efforts, most crucially, opening up the taps on subsidies and funding. It also didn't help the French case that Napoleon, in October 1804, ordered the British ambassador in Hamburg, George Rumbold, to be kidnapped. It showed that rather be chastened by the reaction to the Enghien affair, Napoleon still felt unbeholden to anyone. The first puzzle piece to fall into place, funnily enough, was Sweden. Gustav IV, literally convinced that Napoleon was an antichrist, joined Britain's coalition in December 1804 in exchange for a large subsidy. Naples too was a natural partner. Overconfident in his position, Napoleon had ordered Saint-Cyr to march on Naples and evict the British ambassador, Lord Eliot. The Neapolitans capitulated to France, even signing a treaty of alliance, but played a double game. An agreement was reached with Russia and Britain in September 1804 to attack Saint-Cyr and thereby tie French units better used elsewhere. Russia followed not long after. In mid-1804, Tsar Alexander dismissed Ambassador Edouville and severed all diplomatic ties to France, starting the Duke of Enghien and Rumbold affairs. However, from there it was not an easy slide into coalition. Foreign Minister Vorontsov and his deputy Adam Czartoryski gradually whittled away Alexander's objections. But even then, the Russians only joined the British at the Treaty of St. Petersburg in April 1805. At first, they were unwilling to commit unless Austria joined, but a sizable subsidy of £1.2 million per 100,000 troops convinced the Russians to give war a chance. Napoleon tried to make a final play for peace, agreeing to abide by Amiens and withdraw from Switzerland. But British gold spoke louder than French promises, and Russia remained committed to the coalition. It wasn't in vain that the Russians hoped for Austrian involvement. Developments in Italy worried Vienna deeply. On January 17, 1805, the Italian constitution was amended to allow for hereditary rule. Then, a few months later, on March 17th, Napoleon accepted the throne of Italy in a ceremony at the Tuileries. The Italian Republic was thereby transformed into the Italian Kingdom, with the Ligurian Republic annexed into French Piedmont. The full royal ascension wouldn't begin until May. At a magnificent ceremony at the Duomo in Milan, Napoleon assumed the Iron Crown of Lombardy, declaring, in Italian, "God has granted this crown to me. Woe to anyone who touches it." For the next few weeks, Napoleon toured Italy, revisiting the battlefield at Marengo and popping into pretty well all the major cities in Lombardy and Piedmont. Eugene was called upon to attend Napoleon in Italy, whereupon he was given the position of viceroy, as well as no less than 16 letters offering such sage advice as, learn to listen, show a good opinion of the people, and don't trust anyone. Day-to-day running of the kingdom would remain Francesco d'Aurilla's purview, while Eugene represented French interests. Napoleon was back in France at Fontainebleau on July 13th, and there he received Talleyrand's reports on the situation in Vienna. In early 1805, Austria's myriad reforms were still underway, and Emperor Franz II, Cobenzl, Colloredo, and Archduke Charles remained steadfast in their belief that a war now would be a disaster. But the Italian coronation changed these calculations. The assumption of the Iron Crown of Italy, the very same crown used by the Holy Roman Emperors, was seen by the Austrians as a gauntlet thrown down by Napoleon. Moreover, the annexation of Liguria and the occupation of Naples were also seen as signs that Venezia was also on the chopping block. Truth being, nothing of the sort was on Napoleon's mind. He wasn't lying when he assured Talleyrand, and Talleyrand assured the courts of Europe, that the French Empire ended at the Rhine and at the Adige. But this did nothing to soothe tensions. Napoleon had first noted Austria's worrying slip into bellicosity in August 1804. There are signs of a coalition forming. I shall not give them time to consider it. It's not just that Austria, by such equivocal conduct, should hold our 300,000 troops at attention while on the shores of the Channel. The court of Vienna will have to discard its ambiguous attitude, for if Vienna is so mad as to tempt the fortunes of war again and listen to the suggestions of London, then woe betide the Austrian monarchy. With such rhetoric as this, it's not hard to understand why Vienna was whipped into a belief, however mistaken, that they were on the cusp of being invaded. Francis and Charles quietly reversed course, their logic being that, with Britain and Russia members of a new coalition, there was a good chance for victory. The alternative was waiting to complete the reforms and go it alone in 1810 or 1811. Though knowing well France's power, Clemenceau's voice was shouted down by a resurgent war party, led by Marshal Karl von Mack. To seal the deal, Britain offered a £4 million subsidy per annum and £1.6 million up front. The Tsar too committed to providing a 75,000-strong army to fight alongside Austria directly. The only missing piece in all of this was Prussia. Though the Prussian aristocracy was inclined to reciprocate Russian support, it was undeniable that Friedrich Wilhelm studiously maintained neutrality had been a great boon. Knowing this well, Talleyrand swooped in to offer all of Hanover to Prussia if only they resist pressure to join the coalition. For the Prussian foreign minister, Karl August von Hardenburg, it was a tempting offer, and so long as it was extended, Friedrich wouldn't risk jeopardizing such a tantalizing reward. Still, even without Prussia and their 200,000 soldiers, the new Third Coalition was an extremely powerful alliance. Russia could deploy 200,000 troops, the caliber of which varied greatly, but the few elite units, especially in artillery and cavalry, could be counted on to perform well. Generals Friedrich Wilhelm von Buxtehude and Levin August von Benningsen, both Russian generals of Baltic German extraction, weren't much chop in a fight. However, they were made up for by Mikhail Kutuzov, Prince of Smolensk. Having fought near constantly for 5 decades, the aging Kutuzov could claim to be one of the most experienced and most capable commanders in all of Europe. Austria too had their fair share of experienced commanders, Wurmser, Alvinzi, Beaulieu. However discredited in Italy, the greybeards were traded out in favour of new blood. The Dukes of Austria, the brothers of Franz II, Johann, Charles and Ferdinand, would all assume field command alongside the borderline incompetent Karl von Mack. It wasn't exactly a dream team, but with 250,000 experienced troops, and revivified by much-needed reform, there was hope that Austria could take on Napoleon's vaunted armies. On the other hand, without huge reserves of men and material to commit, Naples, Sweden and Britain would fight on the peripheries, numbering around 50,000 troops. The Royal Navy and British gold were the real contributions being made. As France's strength was sapped by blockade, the coalition members would take British gold to wage a continental land war. The commitment, enunciated most clearly by William Pitt, was to return France to its natural borders of 1792. The Italian states would all be restored, and the Austrian Netherlands split between Prussia and a restored United Provinces. In the face of an old guard Europe arrayed against France, Napoleon might have been expected to pull back from the brink. But he remained supremely confident. As he later declared, "He who fears being conquered is certain of defeat." This was no time for fear. The army of England was withdrawn from the coasts and moved nearer the borders. The plan now was to cross the Rhine, strike deep into Austria with the aid of German allies, and end the threat posed by the Austrians, the Russians and the British once and for all.